Here's another video I never thought I'd make. Disney is dying of self-inflicted wounds. I think hundreds of millions of us grew up as Disney fans. We grew up with the classic Disney movies from Walt Disney's era all the way through the Disney Renaissance of the 90s into the Pixar period through the early 2000s. And we have sort of this ingrained, built-in nostalgia and love for the magic and charm that Disney has always been. And yet it's become increasingly clear that in the last decade or so, Disney has lost the magic. To make things worse, it seems that Disney over and over blames the fans anytime when their projects fail, and so many of them do. Now, of course, there is real bigotry in the world, but surely not this many people who grew up loving Disney and not caring about the diversity in the films when it was done right are certainly all of a sudden just totally bigoted. Could it possibly be something to do with the quality of the films, the stories being inferior, the art itself being inferior? I hope and think that Disney might finally be recognizing this.
I think what had happened over a period of time is that creators lost sight of what their number one objective needed to be. Entertain, and if you can infuse it with positive messages and have a good impact on the world, fantastic. But that should not be the objective.
But is it too late? I think so, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But first, just a quick look at the financial picture of Disney. Bob Iger is an extremely smart and capable man, and under his leadership, Disney has grown. But in the last few years, that growth is a little bit artificial. So, for example, something similar, believe it or not, is happening in American churches. The Southern Baptist Convention for years was growing in numbers of churches that were under its leadership, and yet its attendance each week was shrinking. So is that real growth? Something very similar is happening to Disney. Bob Iger has very suavely increased and bought more intellectual properties, cut more deals, even with Taylor Swift recently. And that's sort of to keep the value to his stockholders. And yet, each one of those properties themselves, most of them, are performing less well. So with $900 million, close to $1 billion in box office flops in 1 year, the closing of a giant Star Wars hotel that was ugly, it wasn't what the fans wanted, overly priced, price gouging, it failed. Many are saying park attendance itself is the one thing floating Disney, and yet even that is not what it used to be. So I would ask the question, how many times can a single company lose hundreds of millions of dollars, $80 million on a single movie, $100 million on a movie, and that not affect their bottom line? Of course, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a Saudi prince or Bob Iger's Disney, eventually this will catch up to you. Eventually, if this continues, it will be harder and harder to get your projects financed. Now, maybe that won't happen today, but this is the inevitable outcome of Disney continuing to fail. But I think the real problem is much deeper than that. The reason why they're failing. We could talk about the inferior art and stories, where I think it's just beyond obvious at this point that the postmodern political ideologies that people are calling woke have become really the primary focus of Disney's art in the last several years. In fact, Bob Chapek said this. He wanted to use Disney as a platform in which he could change hearts and minds to this way of thinking. Now, I'm a millennial. I have many millennial friends, Gen X friends, Gen Z friends. But the thing is, even if you take the conservative portion of the country, which is a large percentage of us, people in the middle and even many on the left have become uncomfortable with how far Disney has pushed this agenda. It's one thing to say, let's be nice to our neighbors who are not like us. It's another thing entirely to make that the focus point of your children's entertainment. And so it turns out most parents just aren't willing to take their children to these things. And that's not just in the United States. This is around the world. Storytelling is essentially a social contract between storyteller, author, filmmaker, and audience. We're going to tell you right up front something about what this film or story or franchise is about. And though we might have plot twists or unexpected endings or some twists and turns along the way, you know essentially what you're getting. That promise has been established by Walt Disney himself. He built for decades. He wanted to make his name synonymous with wholesome, clean, quality family entertainment. And I think he achieved that in one lifetime, and it's really an amazing thing to watch. And yet, in the last decade or so, the Walt Disney Company has unfortunately eroded a bit of that. I think in every one of those categories. One, it's no longer quite as clean. I can no longer put my child in front of a Disney program without asking the question. And I think if I as a parent or you as a parent now have to ask yourself the question whether or not you need to screen this Disney film before you show it to your children, I think that's not a good place for a company built on children entertainment to be. And then there's the quality of the films. I don't think it's even questionable that the writing, sometimes the acting, the beautiful scores that Disney was known for in the 80s and 90s, which is basically Broadway plays, the best, put into some of the best animation in human history, those things have suffered. Oftentimes in the last several years, the music itself isn't as good. When I go out in public, I don't hear little kids singing the Wish songs very often, like they did Frozen or Rapunzel. And I would argue even the animation itself seems to be deteriorating. And so it's this betrayal of the promise that Walt Disney Company has made and built up this reputation over the decades, since before we were born, that has been betrayed. And anytime an audience feels like the expectations have been betrayed, they feel frustrated. And again, the Walt Disney Company blames the fans. This has driven a wedge between the storyteller and the audience. This is a self-inflicted wound that is caused by Disney, not the fans. Now, I am confident that many writers today are no longer focused on, the monomyth or the hero's journey or, three-act structure, so much as they're concerned with postmodern ideology of deconstructing power structures, or if you think there's a trope in a story, we just need to overturn that trope and break your expectation. But so often, they don't just break your expectation, they betray it. So they'll take a hero that you have grown up with, know and love, or that you think should be a certain way, and they'll just flip it on its head. Of course, this is just common sense writing 101 and going to frustrate the audiences. And yet Disney blames not the writing staff, not the ideology, but the fans. Because it turns out overturning a trope or betraying an expectation doesn't leave you with a good story. And ultimately, that's what we go to the movies for. And here lies what I think is the deepest cause of Disney's problems. It's not just economic. It's not just economic factors and pressures weighing in on Disney. It's because people have lost trust in Disney. And I think it's because Disney has often betrayed that trust. And so there's not just financial capital, there's a social capital. And that is what Disney has been hemorrhaging for a decade now. Sure, they keep buying more intellectual properties and studios. Sure, they keep pumping out inferior products, just trying to grind to keep that steady income flow. But the products themselves have deteriorated. The greatest franchises in American history have become reduced to not cinema, but content. This content is increasingly forgettable. You can watch it once and forget about it. You can skip it and really you miss nothing. This is tragic when you're talking about some of the greatest, almost modern myth level franchises in cinema history. And I think the majority of us no longer trust Disney like we used to. Someone once said that fiction is sort of like the willing suspension of disbelief. In other words, to enjoy something that I know is false or a myth or fiction, I sort of have to turn off the part of my mind that tells me it's fake and enter into that world suspending my disbelief. But I think J.R.R. Tolkien actually had this a little bit more accurate. The internal consistency of a world, of an imaginary place, has to be cohesive. It has to be consistent. But once you start mocking the rules of that fantasy world, of that fairyland, or once you begin to break the rules of fairyland, well, my mind naggingly tells me, this is not real, this is fake. And though I knew that to begin with, now I'm no longer able to enjoy it because the model has collapsed. This is what Disney has been doing. There was a time when I would take my family to Walt Disney World, a couple of times a year. Now it's too expensive. You get less for your money and you pay more money. But also, the magic isn't what it was there. That willing suspension of disbelief has been broken. Not, I think, by me as someone who grew up loving Aladdin and the classic Disney movies like Pinocchio, or Winnie the Pooh, or Peter Pan. I think the suspension of disbelief, or as Tolkien said, that inner consistency of the fantasy land has been broken by the people inside of it. They take my mind out of the fantasy with modern politics, postmodern ideology, preachiness beyond belief, poor stories, mocking their own IPs because they no longer fit with the current writer's ideologies. I mean, would you like me to buy my daughter a princess doll or not? Now, there's one thing to acknowledge problems in the ideologies of the past and try to reform those. It's another thing to betray the expectations of your audience or preach at them, look down upon them. Because the thing is, we as audiences, we notice these things. And I think Disney has hemorrhaged social capital. And even if Bob Iger is a very smart man, I do think he's going to do his darndest to probably buy more IPs, increase the value of his company, and please his shareholders. The problem is, can Disney regain that social capital? Can they rebuild trust with audiences that has been largely lost? For my own part, I miss the old Disney.